Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This time you can actually hear me. Without further ado, welcome to All About Steam, Episode 7, LNER A1/A3. Today we have the Flying Scotsman filling in for us with our A1/A3. The London and Northeastern Railway LNER gradually classes A1 and A3 locomotives represented two distinct stages in history of the British 462 Pacific steam locomotives, designed by Sir Nigel Gresley. They're designed for mainline passenger services and later express passenger services. Initially on the Great Northern Railway, GNR, they constitute company of London and Northeastern Railway after the amalgamation of 1923, for which they became a standard design. The changing class designation to A3 was reflected in fitting the same chassis of a higher pressure boiler with a greater superheating surface and a small reduction in cylinder diameter, leading to an increase in locomotive weight. Eventually, all of the A1 locomotives were rebuilt, most to A3 specifications, but no, 4470 was completely rebuilt as a Class A1/1. The names of the locomotives came from a variety of sources. The first, Great Northern, was named after its parent company. Others were given names of high-ranking railway officials, but most were given the name of famous racehorses. One was named after the company's most famous long-distance passenger train, the Flying Scotsman. Flying Scotsman is the sole survivor of the class to be preserved. The new Pacific locomotives were built at Doncaster plant in 1922 to the design of Sir Nigel Gresley, who had become the chief mechanical engineer of the GNR in 1911. The intention was to produce an engine capable to handle without assistance mainline express services that were reaching limits of the capacity of the IVET large boiler Atlantics. Gresley's initial Pacific project of 1915 was for an elongated version of the IVET Atlantic design with 4 cylinders, finally realizing that he was in design impasse. He took as a model the new American Pennsylvania Railway. He took as a model the new American Pennsylvania Railroad Class K4 Pacific of 1914. This in turn had been updated from a series of prototypes scientifically developed in 1910 under Francis J. Cole, Alco's chief consulting engineer at Schneider. I'm not sure how to say that. And the Pennsylvania's K-29 Alco prototype of 1911, also designed by Cole. Descriptions of those locomotives appeared in the British technical press at the time, gave Gresley the elements necessary to design a thoroughly up-to-date locomotive. The first two GNR Pacifics, 1470 Great Northern and 1471 Sir Frederick Banbury, were introduced in 1922. The Great Northern Board ordered further 10 1470 class locomotives, which were under the construction at Doncaster at the time of the formation of the LNER in 1923. This included this future sole surviving member of the class 4472 Flying Scotsman, then nameless and numbered 1472. In the line of philosophy behind Cole's Alco prototypes, the Grizzly Pacifics were built on the maximum limits to the LNER loading gauge, with a large boiler and wide firebox, giving a large gray area. The firebox was set low and rested on the trailing carrying axle. However, unlike the Pennsylvania K4, the firebox was not the flat-topped bell pear variety, but a round-topped one that was in line with the Great Northern tradition. This right here, it ain't flat, it's round. Features in common with the American types were the downward profile toward the back of the firebox and the long firebox and the tapering towards the front. Heat transfer and the flow of gases were helped by use of the combustion chamber extending forwards from the firebox space into the boiler barrel, along with the boiler tube length limited to 19 feet, 5.8 meters. Features inherited from the K4 type, not presented on the earlier coal prototypes. The boiler pressure was rated at 180 pounds per square inch. The 1470 class Pacifics was the third Great Northern locomotive type to be incorporated in Gresley's universal 3-cylinder layout. All 3 cylinders drove the middle coupled axle. The outside cranks were set at 120 degrees, with the inside crank displaced about 7 degrees to allow for the 1 1/8 inclination of the inside cylinder. This slight deviation from even spacing being a suggestion by Hartford Holcroft, the SECR, which enabled the outside cylinders to be perfectly horizontal. Gresley conjugated valve gear derived the motion of the inside valve spindle from the 2 outside valve spindles, the inside-outside. This eliminated the accessible middle set of valve gear in between the frames, a feature of the K4 that soon became abandoned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Was an unusual 3-bar version of the large slide bar. However, Gresley adopted this type of slide bar for all of his locomotives, and it was later taken up by Boyd for his Pacifics, and by Riddles for the British Railway standard designs. Without further ado, the cab tour. So right here we have the reverser, train brake, locomotive brake, regulator, it's hard to see, whistle, firebox, stuff I think that's the water valve, I don't know, cylinders, exhaust injector, live steam injector, blower. I think that's all you can move. We do also have the top vent. I think. Yeah, the top vent. I believe windows. Yep, windows open on this. Yeah. Alright. Back to the facts. The Great Northern Railway was incorporated into the newly formed LNER with the result of the 1923 grouping. I'm about to be speeding. Okay. 1923 grouping. Gresley was appointed chief mechanical engineer of the new company, which was the second largest of the big 4 railway companies in Britain. Realizing his need for standardization, Gresley adopted his GNR Pacific design as the standard express passenger locomotive for the LNER mainline, designated at A1 with the LNER locomotive classification system. The choice was made after the comparative trials of the equivalent Northeastern Railway Pacific, classified A2, built between 1923 and 1925. 51 A1 locomotives were built, 20 by the North British Locomotive Company, NBLC, and a remainder by Doncaster Works. However, Gresley's Pacifics had designed to work within the boundaries of the Great Northern Railway, meaning maximum distances of less than 200 miles. After the grouping, locomotives are required to have a far greater operating range. In 1924, numbered 4472 Flying Scotsman, renumbered and named for the occasion, was displayed at the British Empire Exhibition (BEE) at Wembley, along with the first member of the Great Western Railway (GWR) Castle class, numbered 4073 Caerphilly Castle. The latter weighed 19.6 long tons, 22.0 short tons, or 19.9 tons. Less than the Pacific, but claimed to be the most powerful locomotive in Britain, with attractive effort rated at 31,625 pounds. In the following months, the two railway companies ran comparative exchange trials between the two types, from which the Great Western emerged triumphant with 4079 Penedus Castle. The LNER learned a valuable lesson from the trials, which resulted in a series of modifications carried out from 1926 on. Numbered 4477 Gay Crusader. Changes to the valve gear included increased flap and longer travel. Sorry. In accordance with Great Western practice, this allowed fuller exploitation of the expansive properties of steam and reduced back pressure from the exhaust, transforming performance and economy. Sorry, I'm trying to read all of this and have to deal with this. It's a lot. Okay. Make sure I don't derail around here. The economies and coal and water consumption achieved were such that the 180 psi Pacifics could undertake long-distance non-stop runs that had previously been impossible. There followed a complete redesign of the valve gear, which was applied to the 2555 Centenary in 1927, with the rest of the class being modified in due course. Locomotives with a modified valve gear, a slightly raised running plate over the cylinders in order to give room for the longer combination lever necessary for the longer valve travel. Another modification was made in 1927 when number 4480 Enterprise was fitted with 220 psi boiler. This was closely followed by two other locomotives which were incorporated variation of the cylinder diameter and superheater size for comparative purposes. This led Grizzly to make a radical departure from Churchward. I can say it, my mouth doesn't work. Churchwood practice by increasing the number of large tubes containing the superheating elements, hence increasing. I don't know which way's forward. This way's forward. Okay, I think. Yes. I do this and do that. There. For right now. Okay. Hence increasing the superheater surface area in contact with the hot gases, thus raising steam temperature. The presence of the larger superheater could be recognized from the square covers on either side of the smoke box, a feature that the locomotives retained throughout the rest of their existence. At the 1925 British Empire Exhibition (BEE), the Flying Scotsman was again exhibited, but by this time the GWR suspended this castle. The outcome of the various experiments and modifications of the A1s in the late 1920s with the new Class A3 Super Pacific, the first example of which was number 2743, Falstead. The locomotive appeared in August 1928 with 220 psi boiler, 19-inch cylinders, increased superheat, long travel valves, improved lubrication, and modified weight distribution. Another development slows down up ahead, so I'm gonna. Another new development was the changeover from right to left-hand drive, less convenient for a right-handed fireman, but more so for sighting signals, resulting in the modification of all earlier locomotives. 27 A3s were built from new up until 1935, with little variation except for a new type of boiler with a banjo dome, an oval steam collector that was placed on top of the rear boiler ring. The first banjo dome was hidden beneath the casing of the Cock of the North in 1934. It was subsequently used in the A4 streamliners. The last 9 A3s were constructed with the device in 1935, and it became the standard fitting on all LNER large, wide box boilers that were applied to the new locomotives until 1949. It was also applied to the replacement boilers on the A3s. Although all the original Class A1 locomotives were eventually rebuilt into Class A3's specifications, it was a drawn-out process that lasted until 1949. 60068 Sir Vista was the last locomotive to be converted. The changeover to left-hand drive took longer, continued into the 50s. Despite having settled on the new standard type, Grizzly continued to experiment on individual locomotives, in which one of the experiments, ACFI feed water heaters, were installed in A1 2576, the White Knight, and A3 2580 shot over. However, on the Pacific's increased in the efficiency, it was deemed insufficient, and apparatus was eventually removed. In 1935, number 2544, Limburg received Tremolf piston valves of an ingenious design with automatically varying steam passages. A3's 2747 Connaught and 2751 Humorist were subjugated to smoke deflection trials following an accident on the London, Midland and Scottish Railway (LMS) due to poor visibility. This included the modification of the upper smoke box area surrounding the chimney. Originally, the whole smoke box wrapper was retained in order to form an air duct, but the exit behind the chimney, but this was found ineffective. Sorry. Reposition myself so I get uncomfortable. The original chimney was replaced by a double stovepipe variety, and a miniature deflector plates were added on either side, angled to concentrate the airflow when the locomotive was on the move. Smoke lifting devices were not a priority with the normal single chimney Pacifics. However, it was with its double chimney and subsequently fitting double Kylap exhaust in 1937. Humorist continued to pose a problem in its regard and always had small wings on either side of the chimney. Finally, in the 1950s, it acquired the peppercorn type deflector plates. The original A1s were coupled to a traditional Great Northern type of tinder with coal rails of a design that could be traced back to the Stirling days. The A1 variant was a much enlarged eight-wheel version carrying 8 long tons, 8.13 tons, or 8.96 short tons of coal, and 5,000 imperial gallons to 23,000 liters, 6,000 U.S. gallons of water. In 1928, a new special type of tinder body was built for the new non-stop Flying Scotsman train. This tinder had a corridor connection and had an access tunnel through the water tank. It was more modern design. It was of a more modern design with high side sheets curved in at the top, and had a coal capacity of 9 long tons, 9.14 tons, 10.08 short tons. In order to be able to pack an extra ton of coal, a single coal rail was provided on this particular series, but was later deemed unnecessary. 10 of these corridor tenders were built, and a non-corridor version of a similar design followed, with an 8-ton coal capacity and no coal rail. Further series of both had disc wheels instead of the previous spoked variety. Now it's time to move on to the World War II era. Wartime service. Along with the Grizzly A3 cylinder types, the Pacific suffered from low wartime maintenance standards, conditions for which they had not been designed. Grizzly's sudden death in 1941 and an unsympathetic successor, Edward Thompson, did not help matters in this respect. 1945, Thompson took the opportunity to rebuild the first of Grizzly's A1 Pacific's Great Northern to the LNER A1/1 specification with the divided drive and separate valve gear for the inside cylinder. Thompson intended to rebuild this configuration. All the Grizzly A1s had not been yet converted into the A3 standard. In the meantime, the remaining Grizzly A1s are reclassified as A10s. The rebuilding of these locomotives, A1/1s, never happened. Instead, the conversion to A3 standard continued. The A1/1 was at first classified as A1 and reclassified as A1/1 when Arthur Peppercorn constructed his own Class A1s in 1947. Alright, it's over. The prototype locomotive 6113 Great Northern had been rebuilt by Edward Thompson into a virtually new design. The first to be withdrawn was 6104 Celerio in 1959, followed by 695 Flamingo, 655 Woolwinder in 1961. Otherwise, the class remained until 1962 and was still operating on express passenger work. The last class member to be withdrawn from British Railways was 652 Prince Palatine in January 1966. 6103 Fighting Scotsman was withdrawn in 1963 and had since been preserved at the National Railway Museum in York. On the 10th of May 1926, during the general strike, locomotive number 2565 Mary Hampton was hauling an express train which was deliberately derailed by striking miners south of Cramlington, Northumberland. On December 10th, 1937, number 2744 No, I'm speeding. Alright. Number 2744 Grand Parade was destroyed in the Castle Cary rail accident when it ran into the rear of a standing train in snowy conditions. The driving firemen survived with minor injuries, although the locomotive and tender were buried under the 4 following coaches. 35 other passengers and railway crew were killed in the accident. As Class A3 locomotives were still in production at the time, the replacement was built with the same name and number. On August 9th, 1947, locomotive No. 60 Permison was hauling a passenger train that was run into by another at Darlington, County Durham, due to a signalman's error. 21 people were killed and 188 were injured. On October 26, 1947, locomotive No. 66 Mary Hampton was hauling an express passenger train that derailed at Gorshnick, Northumberland, due to an excessive speed through a crossover. 28 people were killed and 65 were injured. On February 19, 1949, a freight train became divided at New Summergate, London. The rear portion was able to run back and cross from the down slow line to the down fast line due to a signalman's error. Locomotive No. 6107 Royal Lancer was hauling a parcels passenger train that collided into the wagons. On July 14, 1951, locomotive 658 Blair Athol was hauling the West Riding Express near Huntington when 2 of its coaches caught fire. 22 people were injured, but all the passengers and crew escaped with no fatalities. On November 14, 1951, locomotive 6100 Spearmint ran away on the 1 in 44 calories incline approaching Glasgow Queen Street Station. A defective repair on a vacuum pipe had left the engine without brakes. The engine, which was scheduled to work the afternoon departure to Leeds, collided with the stock for the same train, which was being shunted across the station. The dining crew were injured in the collision. This is a part of the line to traverse. August 5th, 1947, locomotive No. 636 Colombo was hauling a passenger train when it crashed into the buffers at York Station. On December 15th, 1961, an emptied coaching stock train was in a rear-end collision with a freight train at Conington Hunt. What are these British names, okay? I want someone who lives in Britain to explain to me what these names are, because they are so hard to pronounce. Huntingdonshire. Locomotive No. 678 Nighthawk was hauling a freight train that ran into the wreckage. A third freight train then ran into the wreckage. We all know who the sole surviving member is, but if you don't, I'll read what I have next, just for you. The sole surviving member of the A3s and A1s is 4472-6103 Flying Scotsman. The locomotive was withdrawn in service with British Railways in 1963. After being saved from scrap, it was sold into preservation by Alan Pegler. After overhaul, Scotsman worked for a number of rail tours, including a non-stop London-Edinburgh in 1968, final year of steam traction on British Railways. After much publicized appeal in 2004, the Flying Scotsman was purchased by the National Railway Museum in York in and now it's a part of the National Collection. A spare A3 boiler was fitted to 641 salmon trout and 697 humorist, but mainly on salmon trout survives at National Railway Museum's National Collection. Cylinder parts from the salmon trout purchased by Alan Pegler still exist to this day. They are part of Flying Scotsman. Of course, we couldn't talk about Flying Scotsman unless we talked about the Railway series. You're welcome, even though I didn't really want to include this. In the Railway series children books by Reverend W. Aldrey, as well as its television adaptation, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, the character Gordon the Big Engine is loosely based on the A1. Built in 1922, he was sold to the Fat Controller in 1923. Once testing was complete, following problems with the conjugated valve gear, Gordon was subsequently rebuilt in 1939 on a two-cylinder chassis designed by the Fat Controller, which explains why he did not look exactly like the A1 in the books. Gordon also has a Fowler tender. The Flying Scotsman also made an appearance in the book Enterprising Engines, where post-reservation numbered 4472 on its LNER appearance with a second tender. He visits his quote-unquote brother, Gordon, at the request of the Fat Controller. The book 2750, The Legend of a Locomotive by H.C. Webster, originally published in the 1930s but republished in 1926, is a fictionalized account of the career of A3 Papyrus. Although the name of the locomotive was never mentioned, only its numbers. I'm gonna come up here and stop right before this, before I end it off. Also, in my mind, Gordon is not an A1. He's an A0. So. Messed up a little past it, but oh well. I want to thank you all for joining me in this episode. This is the longest, I think, episode that we've had left. Good 32 minutes of reading. So, now see you on the next one. Goodbye.